Hey, what's up, everybody? We're going to try something new this evening. I know you guys are used to a Tuesday night stream with all five of us, and you're looking at just two of the five, 40% of the Boiler Express crew. But as you all know by now, we are partnered with Big Banter Sports, which has a podcast for every team in the Big Ten. And one of the things they do each week is they do a Big Ten power rankings and a top 25 composite between all the pods. And so we thought we'd try out talking through our own rankings. Of course, we have five guys in the podcast, but not all five necessarily vote or put out a poll each week. Frank kind of heads up the power rankings, and I kind of head up the top 25. We do bounce off our ideas off the rest of the pod and kind of see what they might think, and we might adjust them accordingly. But for the most part, Frank handles the power rankings, and I handle the top 25 rankings. And so we thought we'd try out explaining that. If we get good feedback, we might keep doing it, or if Frank and I just have fun with this, we might just do it for our own pleasure. So what we're going to start with is we're going to start with Frank's power rankings, or the Boiler Express power rankings. I'm going to let him talk through kind of the bottom half, maybe give a little bit of notes myself, and then have him do the top half, and then we'll jump into the top 25. So first off, Frank, how you doing? How was your weekend?
Oh, weekend is good. Would have loved to have seen a football win and a basketball win. Unfortunately, neither happened, but the basketball game didn't count. So, learned a lot about the team, though, both teams, football and basketball. But outside of that, couldn't be doing better.
Yeah, this is you kind of bring up a good point there that with these struggles that we've had in football, especially, this can be a little bit of a reprieve to think about some of the other teams in the country, how things are going elsewhere, and maybe some of the teams that are struggling as bad or worse than we are. So let's just jump right into the power rankings. Starting at 14, who you got in your bottom of your power rankings there, Frank?
Yeah, so 12, 13, and 14 were really tough. It was kind of neck and neck for that, to rank these. But for 14th, I did put Michigan State. For a lot of reasons, they are 2-6 now. They've just really struggled since the whole Mel Tucker debacle. They haven't looked good, and they honestly just haven't looked competitive in the majority of their games. And I think that with talk of certain players, impactful players, team captains wanting to leave the team, that just kind of signifies internal turmoil, in my opinion. So that was really the ultimate reason that I decided to go with them at 14. It just seems like the team's kind of given up. But that's ultimately what led me to land them at 14. Any disagreement there?
No, just keep going on with 13
Okay.
and work your way up to about 8, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, so 12 and 13th were really the hardest between these bottom three. So 13th, I did go with Indiana. Now, on one hand, they did look good against Louisville. I think what were they down 21-0 at halftime? Came back, had an opportunity to win the game. Mm-hmm. They hung in there with Penn State, but then in the beginning of the season, they struggled against Akron. They've definitely been in there in some games and struggled with some games that they maybe shouldn't have, but. As you said earlier today, they've yet to log a Power 5 win. And until they do that, I think they deserve to be in the 12, 13, 14 spot. So ultimately, I did go with Indiana for number 13. The number 12 spot, unfortunately, I did have to go with Purdue. I expected us to be a lot more competitive against Nebraska. And it's a pretty big drop for Purdue this week. I think we had them at 10th this past week, so we're dropping them 2 spots. But yeah, I mean, I think in the first drive of the game, or the opening kickoff, you recover a fumble and then you just go backwards, and get out of field goal range. That just kind of set the tone for the entire game. We struggled moving the ball, we struggled containing on defense. This last game was really telling about where we stand as a football program. So I think 12 is a pretty good spot for Purdue. 11th, I put Illinois. Illinois hung in there. Purdue does have the win over Illinois, but outside of that win, that was kind of an outlier performance for them. And I think they looked really good against Wisconsin, even though they couldn't get the win. They hung in there till the very end. And they have the win now over Maryland, right? So that was a good reason to put them at 11th, I thought. And then Northwestern's looked really good. I had them at 10th. I feel like they've looked better. They've looked like a better team than Illinois lately. Let's see, who did they beat this past weekend? Or did they beat? It was the win over Maryland. That maybe put them at the number 10 spot. which leads me to number 9, who is Maryland. And Maryland, they've kind of eked out some wins. They struggled against, Virginia earlier in the season, but they kept winning, so we kept having them ranked high. Granted, it is college football, and you never know, you're going to get some inconsistency throughout the season with different teams, but I feel like 9's a good spot for them based on the season as a whole and what we know right now. And that leads me to number 8, where I put Nebraska. And I feel like Nebraska really struggled earlier. They looked really bad early in the season with Jeff Sims, but they've really got things going with Harburg. Defensively, they look a lot more sound. Their defense is something to fear, honestly, and we saw that this past weekend. So their ability to run the ball, their ability for him to kind of roll out, scramble, and make plays. I think they look like a more complete team right now than they have in a while. They looked really good against Northwestern. And Purdue won the turnover battle, and they still won by double digits. So I think that was a really good, appropriate spot for them. So with that brings us from 14 to 8. Any comments so far here, Russ?
Yeah. So originally, I thought I might argue Purdue over Illinois just because I got to fight for my Boilers.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard when we're 2-6 overall, and our win is over Illinois head to head. But I would say that the Maryland win is a little bit better than beating Illinois at home. So I think that's in the right spot there. But I would actually put Northwestern over Maryland. When you look at the fact that, yes, Maryland was very hyped to go into the Ohio State game. Many people had them in their top 25, and you could debate that, whether that's correct or not. But, obviously they've lost 3 straight now, including the Ohio State game. And their 2 wins are Michigan State and Indiana, which are 2 teams that have 0 Big Ten wins. And Northwestern's actually, 2-3 in conference as well, same conference record as Maryland, but they've beat Minnesota and Maryland. So I would argue that their wins in conference are better. And yeah, they're one worse game overall, but they started from a similar spot as Michigan State, right? Almost maybe worse because they went into the season without their head coach.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were definitely reeling. They were trying to figure out who they were. They've made a quarterback change, and they're one of the teams in the West that could surprise people and find a way to get to Indy. So I would probably put them over Maryland, but the rest of that I would say is pretty solid.
Yeah, the Illinois, Northwestern, Maryland was a really tough 3 to kind of iron out. I try not to have too much of a recency bias. I try to think about the season as a whole, but Maryland started off really hot, and they've struggled as of late. And I know everyone loves to talk about the Big Ten East versus the Big Ten West and how much harder the East is, but it's I find it a little odd that an East team is 0-2 against the West. So that's just the way it goes sometimes, unfortunately.
Well, and it's easy to start 5-0 when we talked about how they had one of the easiest schedules in all of FBS: Towson, Charlotte, Virginia, Michigan State, and Indiana. So I would say Purdue could probably go 5-0 against that schedule, personally. But
a healthy Purdue, probably, yeah.
True. So who do you have 7-1, Frank?
Yeah, so this is where it gets really tough. This kind of middle of the pack. But 7th, I felt it was appropriate to have Minnesota. Again with them eking out the win over Iowa, who's been really, really solid this season, and then just looking really dominant over Michigan State. I felt that was just an appropriate place to have the 7th ranked Big Ten team. They should dominate a team that we have it ranked at 14th. So I felt that was a good place to have them. So that brings me to number 6, where I actually have Iowa here. In Iowa, they play the ugliest brand of football. But they're 6-2. They did just lose to Minnesota, but they really dominated a good Wisconsin team. Looked really good against Purdue. They've just really just continued to grind out the wins, and no one has looked like they should be better than them in this spot. So they've kind of been hovering around this 5-6 spot in our power rankings all season, and really I just don't see a reason to move them. So that brings me to Rutgers, who I have at number 5. And this one was interesting because they are coming off of a loss. Is that right?
Rutgers? No, actually, they just beat Indiana. So
okay,
they
did just beat Indiana. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. It was yeah. So their losses to Michigan, which no one is not embarrassing at all, and then losing to Wisconsin. Wisconsin. It was a healthy Wisconsin. It was before Mordecai was hurt. So again, they don't really have a bad loss, and they blew out Virginia Tech, who Purdue struggled with. I just feel like in 5th place is a solid landing point for them. And one could argue. So at number 4, I do have Wisconsin, and one could argue that without Mordecai, Wisconsin shouldn't be in this position. But again, since then, they've only lost to Ohio State. They beat Illinois. They did eke out that win, made a great comeback, which to me is a sign of a good team. And only giving 24 points up to Ohio State, I feel like is pretty impressive. So this is a team that's kind of been locked at that number 4 spot, and I just don't see a reason to move them until proven otherwise. And so third, it's probably no surprise, the top 3 teams in the conference. Third, we have Penn State, who kind of worried me this past weekend, just from a Penn State standpoint, that they did struggle with Indiana, and it did take till the end of the fourth quarter for them to finally pull away. But no, obviously losing to Ohio State, there's no shame in that. Ohio State's really good. So I have them solidified at that number 3 spot until proven otherwise. Number 2, we do have Ohio State. They look like the best team on the field in every game they've played this season. One could argue maybe they weren't the best team on the field against Penn State, but neither team looked great in that game. And it wasn't due to defense. It just was due to sloppiness and lack of execution, I thought. So both teams just seemed kind of out of sorts in that game. But Ohio State, they look really solid. Marvin Harrison Jr. is obviously one of the best players in the country. Kyle McCord's really finding his stride. Defensively, they're really solid and sound. And so if you haven't guessed, number 1 is Michigan. Even outside of all the scandals and stuff, they still look like the most dominant team in the conference. Ohio State's looked really good, but Michigan has just obliterated every team they've played. I'll be really excited when those 2 teams finally do play one another. So given that, Russ, any thoughts on the 7 through 1 there?
Yeah, obliterated might be an understatement for Michigan, but I'll talk about them a little bit more in the top 25. But yeah, it's hard. Like you said, it's hard to rank the West. It's down to probably 4 or 5 teams. So there's really, I would only take Illinois and Purdue clearly out of the conversation in the West. Northwestern's got an outside shot. They're maybe like kind of the dark horse, but the other 4 teams between Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin, it's going to come down to these last few games. And luckily, for the scheduling purposes, they're all kind of facing each other in the last few weeks of the season here. Minnesota is actually the team that is the only team that controls their destiny.
Yeah,
they have not played Wisconsin, and they have beaten both Iowa and I just blanked.
Minnesota has beat Iowa. They beat Illinois, right?
And Illinois, and I thought there was no one, but yeah. So they have the tiebreaker against Iowa and Nebraska. Sorry, Nebraska's the team I was thinking of. So they're tied in losses with Iowa, Nebraska, and Wisconsin, but they have wins over Iowa and Nebraska, and they still play Wisconsin. So Minnesota is actually the team with the tiebreakers. But I would probably put my money, if I had to bet on somebody, I would probably put it on Nebraska at this point. I know that sounds kind of wild. I know that's recency bias because they just knocked us off.
Well, and if you believe in momentum, I'm right there with you. I mean, I wasn't convinced that Nebraska was where their fans thought they were until this game against Purdue last weekend. Now, either one or two things, like Purdue's just fallen really hard, or Nebraska really is legitimate. But I think that they're really finding their stride and they're understanding the brand of football they want to play. So that I'm right there with you on that. If you believe in momentum, which I fully do.
And speaking of momentum, 2 weeks ago, who was probably the West favorite? Maybe Iowa, maybe Wisconsin, but
yeah,
what's the difference between Nebraska and Iowa? Tell me the difference other than their jersey color, right? Dominant defense, one of the best defenses in the country, and an offense that just can't, seem to get much going.
Yeah.
But who's got the better offense? I would say Nebraska
right now. Yeah. And earlier in the season, Wisconsin, I would have said had the better offense. Mordecai was really good. I mean, they do have one of the top running backs in the country in Wisconsin and Braylon Allen. But yeah, right now, Nebraska's offense is singing really well.
Yeah, in their next 2 games, they've got at Michigan State, which should be kind of that's not necessarily a get-right game because they did just beat Purdue pretty handedly, but that should be an easy game for them. And then Maryland at home. Again, you've seen Maryland struggle, and they're dropping like a rock. And then it just comes down to at Wisconsin and home against Iowa, their last 2 games. So, yeah, I would put my money on Nebraska. And, Ohio State, they're going to have a shot, obviously, against Michigan to prove whether they can get it done this year or not. And Michigan has all their scandals and things going on. But until something actually comes down from the NCAA besides just a slap on the wrist, it's hard to not have Michigan number 1 pretty much everywhere. So,
yeah, they definitely look like the best team in the conference and probably a top 3 team in the country. I can't say my knowledge outside of the Big Ten is as extensive as it is inside, but they they look like a top 3 team in the country, in my opinion.
Definitely. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into talking about all the teams across the country. I'm going to go ahead and go, somewhat quickly from 25 down to 11, and then we can jump more depth to the top 10 teams. But I'll let you comment on 25 to 11. At 25, I actually have Missouri. They're 7-1. I know they're, I think, 13th nationally going into this week, so I'm seeming quite low on them. But who have they played? Who have they beat? Their best wins probably at home against Kansas State by 3 earlier in the year. But Kentucky, you could maybe say, but Kentucky's kind of pulling a Maryland. They had a pretty easy front-loaded schedule, and they're dropping off kind of like a rock there. But 24th, I've got Oklahoma State. They're 6-2, coming off a 45-13 home win over Cincinnati. They've also got wins over Kansas and Kansas State, and they're actually the hottest team in the Big 12 right now. I know a lot of people don't have them ranked yet. Maybe they'll be ranked this week in the AP poll. Who knows? But they're the only team in the Big 12 with 4 straight wins in conference right now. Oklahoma just dropped that game. Texas obviously lost to Oklahoma. So to me, they're one of the hottest teams in the Big 12, and we get to see them play Oklahoma this week. So, non-Big 10 games, if you want to look at one, look at Oklahoma State, Oklahoma. I've got Kansas at 23, 6-2 as well. They're coming off an upset of Oklahoma, 38-33, in a really good game there. 22, I've got Air Force. They're 8-0, and I know I'm low on them as well compared to the rest of the country, but they have 0 Power 5 wins at 8-0. Yes, you can only beat who's on your schedule, but that's one of the many, talking points of the cliche things people say that I hate is you can only beat who's on your schedule. Well, you build your schedule and you choose your conference, especially now more than ever. You choose your conference and you definitely build your non-conference. So, you've got 3 other teams in the Mountain West at the top there. And Fresno State has 2 Power 5 wins. UNLV has a Power 5 win. Wyoming has a Power 5 win. So you can still schedule those games as a non-Power 5 to boost that resume. And until Air Force kind of proves it, which I guess is going to come at the end of the season or when they play the rest of these teams, I don't know if we'll see really what their ceiling is. At 21, I have Miami of Florida, another one of the teams that's not ranked or getting a lot of respect nationally, but they are 6-2. Yes, they struggled this week in an OT win over Virginia, which actually had me drop them in our rankings. I had them up in the teens, so I did drop them down, but they do have wins over Clemson and Texas A&M as well. And Georgia Tech is one of their losses, and they just knocked off North Carolina as well this week. So at 20, I do have the North Carolina team at 6-2. 19, I've got Tennessee at 6-2. Oregon State, I have at 18. They're also 6-2, and to me, they might be the best 6-2 team in the country. They have wins over Utah and UCLA. Their 2 losses are both 3-point losses on the road to Washington State and Arizona, which their last game was this loss to Arizona. At 17, I got UCLA at 6-2. 16, I got USC at 7-2. They struggled at Cal this week, but still escaped with the W. It was one of those exciting Pac-12 games. Cal went for 2 at the end of the game to try to win the game, as you want to see those underdogs do, and they failed. So USC escaped. 15, I got Notre Dame at 7-2. LSU, I have at 14 at 6-2. 13th, Utah, also 6-2. At 12, I've got Louisville, 7-1. I get that this might be high on them, but they are a Power 5 team with just 1 loss. So they're the lowest Power 5 team with 1 loss in my rankings, but I think you got to give them some respect for being just a 1-loss team, even though it is to a Pittsburgh team. They do have 2 ranked teams over Notre Dame, and they just blanked Duke 23-0, who Duke was a top 20 team going into that game. And then 11, I have Ole Miss or Mississippi at 7-1. So any thoughts there at that kind of big portion of the top 25 there, Frank?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that sticks out is obviously Air Force. They are undefeated, and you're right. You can only play, who's on your schedule. You can only beat who's on your schedule. But I think they're appropriately ranked here. You have no idea how they would, fare against a Power 5 team or someone from the Big 12 or the Big 10 or the SEC, but they just play the most disciplined, like mistake-free football. They're a really fun team to watch. And so going back to Miami, you said you dropped them despite the win. Is that what you said?
Yes. Yeah.
And you said they barely escaped against Virginia. I know this year's Virginia team, they've been in a lot of the games. Like they're kind of like what was it, Nebraska last year and even the year before, where it's like, well, they're a 3-9 team, but like I think when you added up all the points they scored and subtracted all the points scored against them, they actually had a positive like scoring margin on the season. So this year's Virginia team very much resembles that. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily like a bad thing for them that they just barely escaped with that. In one other comment, it's crazy to see USC fall, so hard. Like early in the season, we were talking about, Heisman candidates. We were talking about, college football playoffs, and just crazy to see how. I mean, they're still a good team, but they're not in that the playoff conversation anymore unless a bunch of other teams lose. Surprising to hear about Oklahoma State. I'm gonna have to dig into that a little bit because you really don't hear a whole lot about them. But if they truly are as hot as you say they are, I'm gonna have to check out some of their footage because you hear about Kansas, you hear about Oklahoma, don't hear about Oklahoma State nearly as much.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and like I said, they beat Kansas and Kansas State teams that we were talking about there. So
yeah.
All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the top 10. So at 10, I have Alabama at 7-1. Despite some Alabama fans, calling for Saban to be done and the sky's falling because they lost to Texas at home and they never lose at home. And, they're still looking like the best team in the SEC West. They joined Georgia as the only two undefeated teams in SEC play. And I think might have to fact check this, but I think the two of them and Florida State and then Ohio State and Michigan are the only 5 teams in a Power 5 conference that are undefeated in conference play. So Alabama still is there. They have not had the dominant wins that they normally might get, but they're still 7-1, and they're still very much in the playoff conversation because they'll have a chance to probably play Georgia in the SEC championship game. And if they win that and they win out, it's going to be hard to keep them out of the playoff. At 9, I have Penn State 7-1. We talked about it just before we came on that I feel like they're still reeling from that Ohio State loss. They barely slipped by Indiana. That again, Indiana's been in a lot of games, but they haven't even beat a Power 5 team yet this year. So I think they've got to kind of right the ship and get things right before they drop a game they shouldn't. Oklahoma, I have them falling to 8 at 7-1. Gabriel is still firmly in the Heisman race. If you watch Big Noon Kickoff, they talked a lot about Dylan Gabriel and some of the storylines and things that he's doing. And then he came out and went 14 of 19 for 171 yards, no touchdowns, and a pick. So not a great game for him. I think he dropped kind of to probably 3rd or 4th in the Heisman standings there. Speaking of Heisman standings, at 7, I've got Oregon at 7-1. Bo Nix is probably 2nd, I would say, in my Heisman rankings right now. Oregon is 3rd in offensive scoring, but they're also 18th in points against. So, you watch a lot of these Pac-12 games, you think that they just don't play defense and they just play offense. Oregon's actually played some pretty solid defense. Texas, I have them as my top one-loss team at 6. They're 7-1. Winning at Alabama still might be the best win of the year, one of the best wins at least in all of college football. And the barn burner against Oklahoma, the neutral site, might be the best loss of any one-loss team in the country. So I've got Texas at 6 there. And then getting into the Power 5 undefeateds. Well, I'm sorry, that's at 6. I'll let you go ahead and jump in if you have any comments there from 10 to 6.
No real comments. I was surprised to hear that Oregon, I haven't looked into their stats a ton. It was such a highly ranked defensive team. Because the 2 times I saw them play, I want to say the game's a pretty high scoring shootout. I did see them play Washington State, and then another game earlier in the season. But that was really interesting to hear. And this really one more comment about Alabama. And the sky is falling. It's the grass isn't always greener. Alabama fan. For those Alabama fans that are listening, the grass is not always greener. It's like when we had the Ohio podcast on. It's like, who are you going to replace Saban with? If you truly want Saban gone and he needs to go, then figure out who you're going to replace him with, because there are not many people better than him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked about it with Ohio State pod, I think, being similar in football to what Purdue is in basketball, and Alabama could probably be this similar conversation. But the problem is Purdue hasn't won a national championship and Ohio State and Alabama have. So, not only is the grass not greener, but don't get too spoiled.
Yeah.
Just because you aren't winning a natty every year doesn't mean you're not one of the top 3 or 4 programs in all of college football, and that anybody outside of that would kill to be where you are 100%. So let's go ahead and jump into the top 5 here. At 5, like I said, we're getting in the undefeateds here. I have Washington. Michael Penix is probably the Heisman frontrunner right now, and the only reason I don't have them any higher is because I still don't think we know what the Pac-12 is or how strong the Pac-12 really is.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of got into a SEC style situation where they had 6 or 7 of their teams ranked in the top 25, and so when they go beating up on each other, sure, it's going to look like these great wins because they're all ranked, but we don't really know how good they are until they have to go, put their money where their mouth is against other Power 5 conference teams in the bowl schedule. So we'll see what happens there. At 4, I've got Florida State. At 8-0, they've definitely righted the ship following that close call against Clemson. They've thumped their last 4 opponents. They're 8th in the country in points scored on the season. And over the last 4 games, they've held their opponents to 14 points a game. So they've looked really good the last few games. I've got Georgia at 8-0. Same thing, like I said earlier. Who have they played? Yes, they're 8-0. Yes, they're in the SEC. Yes, they're undefeated. But they also build their schedule, and they don't ever build a good Power 5 non-conference team, and so you don't really know who they are until they get to meet their schedule. But I do think their next 3 straight games are all against top 25 teams. So we'll get a little bit better idea of what they're looking like. At 2, as you could probably guess, I have Ohio State. At 8-0, they've got 2 wins over top 10 teams. One obviously on the road at Notre Dame in that hostile environment on a Saturday night. They pulled it out at the very end. Their defense is very much elite, but their offense has struggled. But Marvin Harrison Jr. might be the best offensive player in the country. He seems to be the guy that's saying, you know what, I'm going to try to carry this offense to enough points to help our defense out and get these wins. And then, of course, number 1, I've got Michigan. They're 8-0. Yes, they're going through some things, but until that hammer drops and something happens and they aren't allowed in postseason, or they have to, let go of their coach or whatever, they're still by far the most dominant team in the country. No team, even though they haven't really played anybody, I get that, but they haven't allowed more than 10 points to any team they've played this year. And their average points per game on defense is 5.9. 5.9. That's tough to do even if you are playing a weak schedule. 5.9 points a game. They're also 9th in offensive scoring at almost 41 points a game. And their offense isn't really ran by one person. Yes, J.J. McCarthy is a very talented quarterback. He's probably top 2 or 3 in the Big Ten, maybe top 10 in the country, but he's only averaging 224 yards passing a game. So he's not having to do a whole lot. Blake Corum, one of the better running backs in the country, only at 75 yards a game. So, they've looked dominant without having to put out a lot of effort there. So thoughts on the top 5 there?
Is Corum still getting a lot of NFL hype like he was preseason?
Yes, he should still be fine. Stat lines don't usually mean a whole lot for especially non-skilled positions or not skilled positions, non-quarterback skilled positions like running back, wide receivers, whatever. Their measurables is what they take into account more. What's the highlight look like? What's their efficiency when they have the ball? Not necessarily because Michigan's a team, like I said, they've blown people out, so their starters haven't necessarily played 4 quarters in any real game this year. So. I think he's still fine NFL wise.
Yeah. Well, and so you touched on it really, really briefly there for a second. You made a comment about like whether or not Michigan will have their coach. What are your thoughts on what's going on in Michigan right now, just personally?
I think it's pretty rough. If you're looking, if I was a Michigan fan, I'd be pretty nervous. I'll put it that way. It sounds like a pretty elaborate thing. It's not a coach just took it upon himself to go do some homework. They're talking about a network of like 40 scouts, at, the opponents of some 30 opponents. And also there's some rumors about selling information to other teams, to South Carolina to win other games to affect their opponents that they're competing with for college football playoff spots. So I think it could be really, really bad. But again, until that hammer drops, the NCAA has proven that they're not the greatest at punishments. They're not the greatest at really trying to drop that fist. And especially with the conference realignment, how much do they really try to make an example of Michigan and maybe put at risk their own existence. And some of those colleges saying, well, the heck with it, we're going to leave the NCAA. Or do they find some kind of middle ground with Michigan and say, look, we've got to drop some sanctions because you clearly violated the heck out of some rules here. So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe this is an unpopular opinion, but NFL teams, they get some of the most advanced scouting reports that you can imagine. I just recently read a book about PFF, Pro Football Focus. It's a really good book. They talk about, some of the scouting reports that they put together for teams. And they would say, like 92% of the time when they line up in this formation with this personnel and they run motion pre-snap, like this is the play they're going to run. And if you can aggregate film, right, and you can start to draw those insights, or you can pay a company like PFF to give you those insights, like how is knowing the play from, let's say, a sign stealing standpoint any different? That's just a really that's kind of the way I look at it. I mean, because when you watch film, you learn teams' tendencies, you learn who they like to use in what situations, you learn what kind of concepts they like to run, how they line up on third down, how they line up on fourth down, what they like to do on early downs, that type of thing. So you gather a lot of information. I just don't know that what they did is that far beyond that. But I did see some of the things that you mentioned it for a second, some of the like conspiracies, let's say, as to how this led to South Carolina just obliterating Tennessee last season. Like there's this crazy like web of events that happened. But really, really when it comes down to it, do you think that whatever punishment, because there will be some punishment, but do you think that whatever punishment is warranted and justified? Like, do you think that what they did is really that wrong or that big of a deal?
Yes. So I'm glad you brought up the percentage and how maybe in a certain formation with a certain personnel, 92% of the time they run that play. But if you know their signals and you know their checkdowns, you 100% know what play they're running. So not to oversimplify it, because college football is a very complex game and the concepts and the personnel you can run out there is very complex. But if I'm playing rock, paper, scissors with you, Frank, and I know that 92% of the time you use rock, then yeah, I'm going to go paper and hope it works. But if I know your signals and I know if you look to the left 100% of the time you're going to use rock, well, now I'm going to beat you 100% of the time. So you don't have to respect any other possible outcomes, even though you might narrow it down to 90% of the time they do that. When you 100% know it, and you have the talent that Michigan does, that's the thing. Like I think Coach Prime came out and said something about, well, you still have to beat the guy man to man. Well, okay, yes, but then that dumbs it down to just the talent level on the field. And Michigan's got the most talented or one of the most talented teams in the country. So, it definitely takes away the chance for a Purdue or an Illinois or some team that's lower that has to use those, check downs and those complex formations, those complex calls to try to level the playing field. Well, that's the same reason why, like when you have Senior Bowls and you have these all-star games, they take out a lot of times, especially in college football, when it's a prospective NFL type of a game where they want to try to display their talent, they take out a lot of concepts that you can run. You can't blitz a certain number of guys. You can't do certain things because they want it to show who's the most talented player. They want it to just come down to that. Well, that's not what college football is. The college football is not just who's the strongest guy on each side of the line, that guy's going to win. It's come up with your complex formations, come up with the going for it on fourth downs, come up with all these different things. But if you know exactly what the guy's going to do and you have the most talented roster, yeah, I feel like that creates an unfair advantage and it should be punished.
And you make a good point. Because I did watch a video the other night and how NFL teams know which DBs watch a lot of film and which DBs don't. And the way they attack DBs who watch a lot of film is they switch up what they've been doing. So like, let's say you're running trips wide. You have 3 wide receivers out to the right and your 2 inside guys, like I run like a levels concept. So one runs 3 yards, cuts in, the one runs 8 yards, cuts in, the outside guy runs a curl. What they might do is on the DB who watches a lot of film on that outside receiver, what they'll do is they'll turn that curl route into like a sluggo or something and catch that DB trying to jump the route and like, boom, now we have a 25-yard completion. So they switch up the play calling to attack the DBs who they punish them for watching film. And so when you truly know what play is actually coming and you can't just say, well, this is what they've done historically, so this is what we expect them to do now, like you really lose that element of surprise. But, Harbaugh has maybe unfairly earned a bit of a reputation as a guy who has a great regular season and then kind of chokes. And maybe this is just something he's, because they obviously have the most talented team on the field. And maybe this is a way to remove that element of randomness for them. But, you know, it's hard to argue against that clip of them against Rutgers. Rutgers was throwing a screen pass and their defensive line just almost stopped. I mean, it was crazy. There is no way to argue that. Like you rush the quarterback, but like they just stopped. Like they just, like, everyone moved to that side of the field. It was pretty crazy. And then, you know, for Schiano to say what he said, you know, it's like something's going on out here. Like this isn't right.
But like if they have a formation where you say 92% of the time they're going to hit the A gap and they're running the ball, but 8% of the time they do a play action. But if you know they're running the ball, you can basically line up on those receivers on the outside. But then as soon as the ball is snapped, just throw all 11 at the run play and you're going to stop them for a loss.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you know exactly what they're doing, like you said, if you know their signals and you know their communication, even if they try to check out of it to something else, you already know, okay, hey, they just checked to this. Oh, hey, they just checked to this. And now you just know exactly what they're doing. And it's really hard to beat a defense that knows that.
And there's all those videos surfacing of, you know, the opposing team calling an audible, and you see the defensive coordinator. It's like, you know, watching what they're doing, and then, you know, he's calling audibles. So it's audible, and going back and forth. But, you know, I'll be really curious to see what happens. And, you know, it's going to sound weird, but I feel bad for Michigan fans, you know, because like they're in the mix every year, and just, you know, hopefully they can play out this season, you know, with their full staff and personnel. But person I really feel sorry for is the guy who, you know, was probably just doing his job and got fired. His name escapes me right now, but the guy who was actually going,
Stallions, I think.
Yeah, Stallions. Yeah, the guy who was actually going and buying the tickets and going to the games. And, you know, as soon as all this comes out, they fire him. It's like, man, he was just doing his job. He was just I guarantee, like, that order came from someone way above him. So he just, you know, that's who I really feel sorry for.
Well, yeah, because, you know, he's, you know, it's easy to try to make him look like the scapegoat because he used his own credit card, right? He communicated directly with these.
That was by design, though.
Yeah, but
yeah,
he makes $55,000 a year. So you think he's paying out of his own pocket these, you know, 40-something games over 3 years to be at the 50-yard line, 4 rows up, pay for all the travel, you know, all the amenities, all the stuff that goes with it.
$1,000+ tickets, right?
It's hard to go to one or two of your team's games if you're going to try to sit on the 50-yard line 4 rows up, like, let alone all the games that he networked. Somehow he got reimbursed for that. And so the university 100% knew. And, you know, you saw some of those shots of like the play card on the side of the field there, where Michigan's holding a card that says, hey, this sign means this sign means this, when they're going like this. And, you know, like, so like they literally know that they've gotten that information from him and they're using it in the game. There's no question that the whole network and all the way up to Harbaugh knew what was going on. So to try to be able to get away with it by firing a scapegoat, that's a little ridiculous.
Yeah, I'll be really, really curious to see what happens. This will definitely set a precedent. It's really opened my eyes to some really obscure rules about the NCAA and how they handle scouting and whatnot. Well, unless you have anything else, Russ, I guess we can go ahead and wrap this. Yeah, so for anyone who's watching, definitely let us know what you think. Definitely let us think where you or let us know where you disagree with, or you think we are right or wrong. Would love to hear your comments and thoughts on these power rankings. And, you know, if it's something that's received well, we'll just we'll keep it going. Or, you know, if Russ and I just like doing it, we'll just keep going for it.
100%.
All right, well, y'all have a great week. Listening.
Yeah, we'll see you Tuesday night.